The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as Prince William walked briskly toward the main entrance. His jaw was set in a tight line, and those who knew him well could recognize the signs of barely contained frustration. The events of the previous evening still burned in his memory like a fresh wound that refused to heal. It had started as what should have been a routine security briefing. William, in his role as a senior royal, was reviewing the protocols for an upcoming state visit when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The guard rotation schedule showed a pattern that shouldn't exist, gaps in coverage that could only mean one thing. Someone was not doing their job properly. The prince had always taken security matters seriously, unlike some members of the royal family who preferred to leave such details to others. William made it his business to understand every aspect of protection. His military background had taught him that carelessness in security could cost lives, and when it came to his family's safety, he would accept nothing less than perfection. As he approached the guard station that morning, William's mind raced through the conversation he'd had with the head of security just hours before. The man had tried to downplay the situation, suggesting it was merely a scheduling error that could be easily corrected, but William had pressed for details, and what he discovered made him realize this was far more serious than anyone wanted to admit. The guard in question was Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a man who had served the royal family for over 8 years. On paper, Thompson was exemplary, decorated, reliable, and trusted with some of the most sensitive assignments. But the reality that William had uncovered painted a very different picture. Thompson had been leaving his post during crucial hours, sometimes for extended periods, with no one covering his responsibilities. What made it worse was that other guards knew about it, but had said nothing. There was an unspoken code among them, a misguided loyalty that put their colleagues' reputation above the safety of the people they were sworn to protect. William understood loyalty, but this crossed every line he could think of. The prince stopped just outside the guardhouse, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Through the window he could see Thompson at his desk, apparently reviewing paperwork with the casual air of someone who had no idea his world was about to change forever. William had spent sleepless hours the night before, weighing his options and considering the consequences of what he was about to do. He could have handled this quietly, through official channels, letting the bureaucracy deal with the problem in its own slow and careful way. That would have been the safe choice, the diplomatic approach that would ruffle the fewest feathers. But William had learned something important during his years of service. Sometimes leadership required making the hard choice, even when it made you unpopular. The security footage from the past month told a story that couldn't be ignored. Thompson leaving his post for what he claimed were brief bathroom breaks that lasted 45 minutes. Security cameras showing him meeting with unauthorized individuals in areas where such meetings were strictly forbidden. Most damaging of all, evidence that he had shared information about royal movements with people who had no right to know such details. William pushed open the door to the guardhouse, and conversation immediately stopped. The 3 guards present snapped to attention, but there was something in the air, a tension that suggested they knew this wasn't a routine visit. Thompson looked up from his paperwork, and for just a moment, William saw something flicker across the man's face. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just the recognition that his comfortable world was about to come crashing down. The prince had rehearsed what he would say, but standing there in that moment, looking at a man whose negligence could have endangered his wife and children, the carefully planned words seemed inadequate. This wasn't just about following protocol or maintaining discipline. This was about trust, responsibility, and the sacred duty that came with wearing the uniform. Thompson stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward a salute before he caught himself. The formal greeting died on his lips as he met William's steady gaze. In that moment, both men knew that whatever came next would change everything. The other guards in the room seemed to sense it too, their discomfort evident as they tried to find somewhere else to look. William's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and controlled, but there was steel beneath the surface that made everyone in the room understand the gravity of the situation. The words that came next would set in motion a chain of events that would embarrass the palace, challenge long-standing traditions, and force everyone involved to confront some uncomfortable truths about loyalty, duty, and what it really meant to serve the crown. Sergeant Marcus Thompson, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and William watched as the color drained from Thompson's face. The other guards in the room exchanged shocked glances, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. In the long history of the Royal Guard, it was almost unheard of for a senior royal to personally dismiss a guard, especially in such a direct and public manner. Thompson's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to find his voice. "Your Royal Highness, I don't understand. If there's been some mistake, surely we can discuss this through proper channels." His voice carried a tremor that betrayed his growing panic. 8 years of dedicated service, a spotless record, commendations from superiors. None of it seemed to matter in this moment. William's expression remained unchanged as he reached into his jacket and produced a tablet. With precise movements, he pulled up the security footage that had damned Thompson. The screen showed clear images of the sergeant leaving his post, meeting with unauthorized individuals, and engaging in activities that violated every security protocol in the book. As the evidence played out in silent accusation, Thompson's face grew paler with each passing second. The silence in the guardhouse was deafening. Outside, the normal sounds of castle life continued. Tourists chattering, cars passing on the nearby road, the distant sound of construction work. But inside this small room, time seemed suspended as everyone grappled with the magnitude of what was happening. The other guards looked between Thompson and William, struggling to process a situation that challenged everything they thought they knew about their colleague and their duties. William turned the tablet so everyone in the room could see the footage clearly. "This isn't a mistake, Sergeant Thompson. This is a pattern of behavior that has put the safety and security of my family at risk." The prince's voice was steady, but those who knew him could detect the controlled anger beneath the surface. He had always prided himself on being fair and measured in his dealings with staff, but this situation had pushed him beyond the boundaries of normal protocol. Thompson tried to step closer, his hands raised in a gesture of supplication, but William held up a hand to stop him. The explanation came tumbling out in desperate bursts. Family problems, financial pressures, a sick mother who needed expensive medical care. The unauthorized meetings were with private security consultants who had offered him work, nothing more. The extended absences from his post were due to personal phone calls about his mother's condition. Each excuse sounded weaker than the last, especially in light of the damning evidence displayed on the tablet screen. But William had already heard these explanations during his investigation. He had spoken to Thompson's supervisors, reviewed the man's personal file, and even made discreet inquiries about his family situation. While he felt sympathy for Thompson's personal struggles, the security breaches were too serious to overlook. The safety of the royal family could not be compromised regardless of individual circumstances. The other guards in the room began to shift uncomfortably as the full implications of the situation became clear. If Thompson could be dismissed so dramatically, what did that mean for their own positions? They had all bent rules at various times, covered for each other during difficult moments, and maintained the informal codes of loyalty that had governed their service for years. Suddenly, those unwritten rules seemed less like brotherhood and more like potential career suicide. William could see the fear in their eyes, and he understood their concern. But this moment was about more than just one guard's misconduct. It was about establishing a new standard, making it clear that the informal tolerance for minor infractions would no longer extend to serious security breaches. The royal family lived in an increasingly dangerous world, and the luxury of overlooking problems in the name of loyalty was one they could no longer afford. Thompson made one final attempt to salvage his career, dropping to one knee in a formal gesture of supplication that seemed to come from another era. "Your Royal Highness, I beg you to reconsider. My family depends on this position. I've given 8 years of faithful service. Surely that must count for something." The desperation in his voice was painful to hear, and for a moment, William felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical force. The prince looked down at the kneeling man, and those present could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. This wasn't easy for him. Thompson wasn't some faceless bureaucrat, but a real person with real problems and a family depending on his income. But William also knew that leadership sometimes required making decisions that caused pain in the short term to prevent greater harm in the future. When William finally spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine regret that surprised everyone in the room. "Sergeant Thompson, Your personal circumstances are unfortunate, and I'm truly sorry for the difficulties you're facing. However, the safety of my family must come first. You compromised that safety through your actions, and no amount of past service can excuse that. The decision had been made, and there would be no appeal, no second chances, no opportunity to make amends. Within hours of Thompson's dismissal, word of the incident began to spread through the palace like wildfire. The story grew and changed with each telling, becoming more dramatic and controversial as it passed from person to person. By evening, what had started as a necessary security decision had become a full-blown crisis that threatened to overshadow everything else happening within the royal household. The first call came to William's private secretary at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. It was from a senior courtier who had heard whispers from his contacts in the security department. His voice was tight with barely controlled panic as he relayed what he had learned, and he kept asking the same question over and over. How could the prince have handled this so publicly? Why hadn't he followed established procedures? These were questions that William had anticipated, but hearing them voiced so soon after the incident still stung. He had chosen to confront Thompson directly because he believed it was the right thing to do, clear, honest, and without the usual layers of bureaucracy that could allow problems to fester. But he was beginning to realize that his approach, while morally sound, had created a political nightmare for the palace establishment. The second call came from the Queen's private secretary, and the tone was significantly more formal. Her Majesty requested a meeting with Prince William at his earliest convenience to discuss recent events. The phrase "at his earliest convenience" was diplomatic language that actually meant immediately, and William knew better than to delay. He had expected this conversation, but that didn't make the prospect any less daunting. As William made his way through the palace corridors toward his grandmother's private apartments, he passed several staff members who quickly averted their eyes. The usual friendly nods and brief conversations were replaced by uncomfortable silence and hurried steps. It was as if he had suddenly become radioactive, and nobody wanted to risk contamination by association. The Queen's sitting room was exactly as William remembered from countless previous meetings: elegant, comfortable, but unmistakably formal. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows created patterns on the antique carpet, and the familiar scent of Earl Grey tea hung in the air. But today the atmosphere felt different, charged with tension that made even this familiar space seem foreign and unwelcoming. The Queen looked up from her correspondence as William entered, and her expression was carefully neutral. She gestured toward a chair across from her desk, and William took his seat, preparing himself for what he knew would be a difficult conversation. For several long moments they sat in silence, the only sound being the gentle ticking of an ornate clock on the mantelpiece. When the Queen finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of experience in managing crises, both public and private. "William, I understand you felt compelled to take direct action regarding Sergeant Thompson. However, I'm concerned about the manner in which you handled the situation. There are established procedures for dealing with security personnel, procedures that exist for very good reasons." William had prepared his response carefully, knowing that he would need to justify his actions to the person whose opinion mattered most. "Your Majesty, I understand your concerns, but the security breaches were too serious to handle through normal channels. Thompson's actions endangered the safety of my family, and I felt immediate action was necessary." He paused, searching for the right words to convey the urgency he had felt without sounding disrespectful to established protocols. The Queen listened without interruption, her fingers steepled in front of her as she considered his words. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied him with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated world leaders for decades. "William," she said finally, "your concern for your family's safety is admirable and entirely appropriate. However, your method of addressing the problem has created complications that extend far beyond the original security issue." She reached for a folder on her desk and opened it to reveal a collection of newspaper clippings, email printouts, and official correspondence. "The media has gotten hold of the story," she continued, "and they're portraying it as evidence of royal arrogance and disregard for working people. Thompson's union representative has already issued a statement calling for his reinstatement and an official apology. 3 different tabloids are running stories about royal families destroying the lives of ordinary workers. William felt his heart sink as the full implications of the situation began to dawn on him. He had been so focused on the immediate security concerns that he hadn't fully considered the broader political ramifications of his actions. In trying to protect his family, he had inadvertently created a public relations disaster that could damage the monarchy's reputation far more than Thompson's security breaches ever could. The Queen continued, her voice remaining steady despite the gravity of what she was saying. The Prime Minister's office has expressed concerns about the incident, particularly given the current political climate regarding workers' rights and economic inequality. They're worried that this story could become a symbol of royal insensitivity at a time when public opinion is already somewhat fragile. Outside the sitting room, William could hear the distant sounds of palace life continuing as normal, staff members going about their duties, visitors being shown through the state apartments, the everyday business of the monarchy proceeding without interruption. But inside this room, he was confronting the reality that his well-intentioned actions had created a crisis that threatened to undermine everything his family worked so hard to maintain. The media storm erupted with the fury of a Category 5 hurricane, catching the palace communications team completely off guard. By the following morning, the story had exploded across every major news outlet, with headlines that painted Prince William as either a decisive leader protecting his family or an arrogant aristocrat destroying a working man's livelihood. The narrative seemed to shift depending on the political leanings of each publication. But one thing was clear. This was no longer a simple personnel matter. The Sun ran with the headline Will's Wrath. Prince destroys guard's life over minor mistake, accompanied by a large photograph of Thompson looking dejected outside his modest London flat. The article painted him as a devoted family man, crushed by royal callousness, complete with quotes from neighbors describing him as a pillar of the community who would never harm anyone. The Daily Mail took a different approach, focusing on security concerns with their headline, Royal Security in Chaos, What William's Dramatic Action Really Reveals. Their story suggested that Thompson's dismissal was just the tip of the iceberg, hinting at deeper problems within the royal protection system that the palace was desperately trying to hide from public view. Even the traditionally supportive Telegraph questioned the prince's methods, running an editorial titled The Right Decision, Wrong Approach, that praised William's commitment to security while criticizing his handling of the situation. The piece suggested that the incident revealed a troubling lack of political sophistication that could damage the monarchy's carefully maintained relationship with the British public. Meanwhile, Thompson had become an overnight celebrity of sorts, though not the kind anyone would choose to be. Television crews camped outside his home, reporters shouted questions at him whenever he appeared in public, and social media was flooded with posts both supporting and condemning him. His elderly mother, whose medical bills had supposedly motivated his security breaches, was photographed being wheeled into a hospital, adding another layer of human drama to an already explosive story. The palace communications team worked frantically to control the narrative, but they were fighting an uphill battle. Every statement they released seemed to generate more questions, and their attempts to provide context only succeeded in keeping the story alive longer. The usual tactics of deflection and careful non-denial denials that had served them well in previous crises seemed inadequate for a situation that demanded clear explanations and definitive answers. William found himself effectively under house arrest, unable to make any public appearances without risking confrontation with reporters, hungry for his reaction to the growing controversy. His planned visit to a children's hospital had to be canceled, a charity engagement was postponed indefinitely, and even his routine appearances at official functions were deemed too risky by his security team. The irony was not lost on him. In trying to improve security, he had created a situation that made his own movements more restricted than ever. He spent his days in meetings with lawyers, communications specialists, and senior palace officials, all trying to find a way to contain the damage without admitting wrongdoing or compromising the security principles that had motivated his original decision. Catherine, his wife, watched the unfolding drama with growing concern. She had supported his decision to dismiss Thompson, understanding the security implications better than most after years of living under constant protection. But she could see the toll the controversy was taking on her husband, and she worried about the long-term consequences for their family and the monarchy as a whole. The children, thankfully, were largely shielded from the worst of it, but even they began to notice that their father seemed more stressed than usual, and that their normal routines had been disrupted. Security protocols that had previously been invisible to them suddenly became intrusive and obvious, a constant reminder that their lives were different from those of their friends and classmates. Thompson, meanwhile, had hired a lawyer and was reportedly considering legal action against the royal family. His union had rallied to his support, and labor leaders were using his case as an example of how the wealthy and powerful could destroy ordinary workers' lives without consequence. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming less about the specific facts of Thompson's dismissal and more about broader issues of class, privilege, and accountability. Late at night, as William sat in his study reviewing the day's coverage and preparing for another round of crisis meetings, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. Not in dismissing Thompson, the security evidence was clear and the threat to his family real, but in how he had handled the situation. Perhaps the Queen had been right about following established procedures, even if they were slower and less satisfying than direct action. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier than it did in those quiet moments, when the noise of the media circus faded and he was left alone with his thoughts and the consequences of his decisions. He had acted from the best of motives, but good intentions seemed like cold comfort when measured against the damage that was spreading through every aspect of his family's life and the institution they represented. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Thompson's own former colleagues. 3 days after the media storm reached its peak, a group of royal protection officers requested an urgent meeting with palace officials. What they revealed would completely change the narrative and expose the full extent of Thompson's betrayal, but it would also raise uncomfortable questions about the culture of silence that had allowed the problem to fester for so long. Detective Inspector Sarah Crawford, a 20-year veteran of royal protection, served as the spokesperson for the group. Her hands shook slightly as she opened a thick folder containing evidence that her colleagues had been secretly gathering for months. "We couldn't stay silent any longer," she told the assembled palace officials. Thompson wasn't just leaving his post or sharing minor information. He was part of something much bigger, much more dangerous. The evidence they presented was staggering in its scope and implications. Thompson had been photographed meeting with known associates of foreign intelligence services. Phone records showed regular contact with individuals who had no legitimate reason to be interested in royal security arrangements. Most damaging of all, financial records revealed payments into Thompson's accounts that far exceeded anything his salary could explain. William sat in stunned silence as the full picture emerged. Thompson hadn't just been a careless guard dealing with personal problems. He had been actively selling information about royal movements and security protocols to hostile foreign interests. The meetings he claimed were about potential private security work were actually intelligence handovers. The extended absences from his post had been opportunities to photograph sensitive documents and areas of the palace. The revelation hit William like a physical blow. His decision to dismiss Thompson, which had been portrayed by the media as harsh and impulsive, had actually prevented what could have been a catastrophic security breach. The man he had been painted as destroying was, in reality, someone who had been systematically betraying the trust placed in him and endangering the lives of William's entire family. Detective Inspector Crawford continued her presentation, her voice growing stronger as she detailed the investigation her team had conducted in secret. They had suspected Thompson for months but had lacked concrete proof until recently. The decision to come forward now had been triggered by their horror at seeing him portrayed as a victim. In the media, when they knew the truth about his activities, the other officers nodded grimly as Crawford explained how Thompson's betrayal had extended beyond simple information sharing. He had provided detailed floor plans of areas where the royal children played, schedules of when security would be lightest, and even information about escape routes and emergency procedures. In the wrong hands, such information could have facilitated kidnapping attempts, terrorist attacks, or assassination plots. William felt a cold fury building in his chest as he realized how close his family had come to disaster. The security protocols he had trusted to keep his children safe had been compromised by someone whose job was to protect them. The casual way Thompson had sold out their safety for money made William's earlier restraints seem almost saintly in comparison. The Palace communications team immediately recognized the implications of this new information. The story that had been destroying William's reputation could now be completely reframed. Instead of an arrogant prince abusing a loyal servant, the narrative would become one of a vigilant father protecting his family from a dangerous traitor. The media attention that had been so damaging could now work in their favor. But William surprised everyone by insisting that the new information be presented carefully and thoughtfully. He didn't want Thompson destroyed in the press despite what the man had done. The security implications needed to be communicated clearly, but he refused to allow the palace to engage in the kind of character assassination that had been directed at him. It was a decision that puzzled his advisors but reflected his fundamental decency, even in the face of betrayal. The detective inspector's presentation continued for over 2 hours, revealing a network of corruption and compromise that extended beyond Thompson to several other individuals within the royal household. The investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic intelligence gathering that had been going on for years, with Thompson serving as just one node in a larger espionage operation. As the full scope of the threat became clear, William began to understand that his instinctive decision to act quickly had been not just correct but potentially life-saving. The established procedures that his critics had insisted he should follow would have given Thompson and his handlers time to cover their tracks and possibly execute whatever plan they had been developing. The meeting ended with plans for a coordinated response that would balance the need to protect ongoing security operations with the necessity of correcting the public record. William would not be vindicated in the eyes of his critics, but at least the truth about Thompson's betrayal would be known. The question now was whether the damage done to the monarchy's reputation could be repaired, and whether the lessons learned from this crisis would help prevent similar situations in the future. Outside the meeting room, William stood for a moment in the palace corridor, processing everything he had learned. The weight of responsibility that came with his position had never been more apparent, nor had the potential consequences of the decisions he made every day. The comfortable assumption that the people closest to his family could be trusted had been shattered, replaced by a harder, more realistic understanding of the threats they faced in an increasingly dangerous world. The carefully orchestrated revelation of Thompson's true activities sent shockwaves through the media and public opinion that dwarfed even the original controversy. Within hours of the palace's measured press release, newspaper editors were frantically rewriting headlines and television producers were scrambling to book new experts who could explain the implications of what had been uncovered. The transformation in public perception was swift and dramatic, but it came with its own complications. The same tabloids that had vilified William just days before now hailed him as a hero who had saved his family from a deadly threat. The headlines switched from condemning his methods to praising his instincts, but the whiplash effect left many people confused and skeptical about what to believe. Thompson, who had briefly enjoyed sympathy as a supposedly wronged worker, now found himself facing serious criminal charges related to espionage and treason. The same media outlets that had championed his cause abandoned him with the same speed they had initially embraced his story. His lawyer withdrew from the case, his union distanced themselves from his situation, and the neighbors who had once described him as a pillar of the community began recounting suspicious incidents they had previously overlooked. William watched this reversal with mixed feelings. While he was relieved that the truth had finally emerged, he took no pleasure in Thompson's downfall. The man had made terrible choices that endangered innocent lives, but William could see how personal desperation and gradual moral compromise had led to a catastrophic betrayal. It was a reminder that even the most trusted individuals could fall when faced with the right combination of pressure and opportunity. The security review that followed Thompson's exposure revealed systemic problems that went far beyond one rogue guard. Background checks that should have been updated regularly had been allowed to lapse. Financial monitoring that might have detected Thompson's suspicious payments had been inadequately implemented. Most troubling of all, the culture of loyalty among the key guards had prevented early detection of problems that should have been obvious to trained security professionals. Detective Inspector Crawford found herself leading a complete overhaul of royal protection protocols, working directly with William to implement changes that would prevent similar breaches in the future. The new systems were more intrusive and demanding, requiring regular polygraph tests, detailed financial disclosure, and psychological evaluations that many existing guards found uncomfortable and demeaning. Several long-serving protection officers requested transfers or early retirement rather than submit to the enhanced scrutiny, creating staffing challenges that took months to resolve. The easy camaraderie that had once characterized the protection teams was replaced by a more professional, but less personal approach that some veterans mourned as the end of an era. William threw himself into the security reforms with characteristic intensity, determined to ensure that his family would never again face the kind of threat that Thompson had represented. He spent countless hours reviewing procedures, interviewing candidates for security positions, and learning about the latest technologies for detecting insider threats. It was exhausting work, but he found it preferable to the helpless feeling of discovering that people he had trusted with his children's lives had been working against them. Catherine supported her husband's efforts while privately worrying about the toll the experience was taking on him. She could see that his faith in the people around them had been shaken, and she feared that the necessary security measures were creating barriers between their family and the staff who served them loyally. The children, too, seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed in their protected world, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what it was. The parliamentary inquiry that followed the Thompson case resulted in new legislation governing security clearances for all royal household employees. The procedures that William had been criticized for bypassing were themselves reformed to allow for more rapid response to serious threats. In a sense, his controversial decision had exposed weaknesses in the system that might have remained hidden until a more catastrophic failure occurred. Years later, as William looked back on the Thompson incident, he recognized it as a turning point in his understanding of leadership and responsibility. The easy confidence of his younger years had been replaced by a more mature awareness of the complexities and consequences that came with every decision. He had learned that doing the right thing often came at a significant personal cost, but that the alternative, allowing problems to fester in the name of diplomatic nicety, could be far more dangerous. The palace had been embarrassed by the incident, but in the end, it had emerged stronger and more secure than before. Thompson's betrayal had been a wake-up call that forced everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, loyalty, and the price of protecting those who serve the public. The lessons learned from that difficult period would influence royal security practices for generations to come, ensuring that William's moment of decisive action would have consequences far beyond the immediate crisis it had created. The story became a cautionary tale within royal circles about the importance of maintaining vigilance even among the most trusted associates, and a reminder that sometimes the most difficult decisions are also the most necessary ones. For William, it marked his full transition from a young prince learning his role to a mature leader, prepared to make the hard choices that his position would inevitably demand.